This is Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Massachusetts. And this is a podcast about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community and beyond. Over the last few months, I've been curious to learn a little bit more about the field of leadership psychology and considerations for Black people in leadership. So last year, I reached out to my colleagues at William James College, and they recommended for me to connect with Dr. Brandi Derr. So she is my guest for today. Dr. Brandi Derr is the director for the Leadership PsyD program at William James College. She's a founding member and senior consultant for Cosmos Consulting. She holds a PsyD in leadership psychology from William James College with a focus on mentorship, public narrative, and Black female leadership capacity building. She also holds a master's in education and counseling psychology with a concentration in trauma studies. So welcome to the show, Dr. Derr.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Williams. This is great.
So tell us, what is leadership psychology? What is organizational psychology? Sure. Are they kind of, I noticed there's two different words. What right. Are they different? Tell me a little bit about that.
So I tend to feel like they're an umbrella term, and it really is about the fact that it does encompass all levels. First of all, individual intervention level, that's with like coaching. And then there's team engagement, there's organizational assessment and development, and then even sort of global and interagency, interdepartmental, like it really just covers all levels. But essentially, there's this desire to switch from thinking of leaders as, this powerful, omniscient force, and to see them as mobilizers to engage groups towards a shared vision or a shared mission. And so consultants who are leadership psychologists or organizational development specialists, they're thought partners for those leaders, and they're creating moments of pause and asking them to suspend their desire to jump to quick solutions and instead to sit in the sometimes discomfort of inquiry, to engage uncertainty and change.
I imagine that it's a culture shift for some places that are used to that kind of, I guess, the model of the power at the top, essentially.
Right. Yeah, it is. Shared leadership it sounds scary because it sort of implies there's a loss of power, and really it's the opposite. It's that you're gaining so much more perspective, so much wisdom in the room, and it actually creates more adaptability on growing and learning teams.
So you're the director for the Leadership PsyD program. Yeah. What's been your journey to leadership as a Black woman?
Yeah, so, I will start by saying that it's my favorite place to be. It's one of my favorite jobs. But thinking about my experience as a Black woman, I walked onto a team that I inherited, and they previously saw me as a student and had not previously had a Black female leader. And so a lot of the work in joining a team that sees me as someone who's still in a position of receiving learning or, taking direction, it took a lot of initial work to think about how to build a sense of psychological safety and confidence. And so a lot of that work was about gathering the team with the support of my department chair and having honest, transparent conversations about what are your concerns? What is it about the past leadership that you want to bring into this new time, and what are some of those components that you actually want to shift? And a lot of it came from folks wanting to make sure that there was shared leadership, that their experience in the department was honored, and that they could be seen as thought partners. And that's really what has been established. And so I will say that I was probably very lucky in my journey that I had folks who very quickly were able to have confidence in me and engage a team that could see me in that way, could see me as their director.
Yeah. No, that is true. I think that's, it's some good fortune, because there are some people that just have such difficulty that they end up having to work somewhere else, essentially.
Right.
It's that, that shift from being seen as you mentioned, kind of like someone just receiving instruction and receiving, guidance to the person that is kind of in leadership. Sometimes people can't achieve that unless they literally go to work somewhere else. It's sometimes hard for a culture shift in that way. So
True.
yeah. Now we were kind of preparing for this podcast episode a little bit, and one of the things that we that you had kind of mentioned when we were talking was that you've noticed that's when someone is in an organization and they see someone else that looks like them, that's in leadership, or maybe not even in leadership, just sees someone else that looks like them in the office space or the organization, that it creates a sense of psychological safety. And I thought that was an interesting concept, because we sometimes talk about representation and we think of it as kind of like, maybe just shared interests or shared, there's other shared cultural things. But the idea of psychological safety in representation, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it's never become more clear to me than I think in this current role. I think about the fact that just someone even considering going into a doctoral program, they are thinking about the fact that, this is uncommon. You and I, two Black women with doctoral degrees, we represent a very small, percentage of the population. Mm-hmm. And there is a need to see someone who looks like you doing something, to have the impression that you yourself can do it as well. And so a lot of candidates that I've spoken to who are wanting to enter the doctoral program at William James College, they will attribute their sort of pressing send on their application because they went on the website and they saw that the director was a Black woman and thought to themselves, oh my gosh, the director's a Black woman. Maybe I could do this. Even persons of color who are entering education later in life, or they're shifting careers, seeing someone who you at least have the sense that they have some shared historical experience with you creates a sense of ease. And so even in the interview process, I'll see the camera will come up and they'll see my face, and then there's something visibly that changes, and the conversation can be different because they're not spending their valuable interview time trying to create that initial bridge. So they're not needing to try to explain to me what it has meant to even get their bachelor's or their master's as a person of color. We get to start from step, 8 and go right into how they want to impact their world and what they want to do with that degree. That intimacy that gets, that happens in the first 5 minutes, you can't replicate it. And then now I look at my current team and there are just more and more brown faces. So I don't think it's a surprise that our student population in the doctoral program has increased. We have so much more representation from not just African American identified, but Caribbean American as well. I wish there was some magic survey I could take, but someday I'll get the statistics on there. But I love hearing the qualitative, data of just candidates and students saying it really just meant a lot. It meant a lot seeing videos of you and of other faculty members, other, department or program directors of color. That meant something. So I feel like just by being myself, just by
being yourself,
right? And that could mean that someone who might not have gone on that journey gets to go on the journey, and they get to join the world in this important way. So it just feels like a lot of privilege and a lot of responsibility. I'm honored. I'm honored.
It's amazing. And as I said before, I like that you kind of use the word psychological safety as kind of like a label, because it does give language to what a lot of people experience, but they can't describe that that's what it is. I even think about my own journey. I'm from a predominantly Black country. And so I've kind of underestimated how much representation I've had from the time I was a little kid. Like all the people in major positions of power were predominantly Black people. So it was kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, of course I can be anything. I can be anything I want to be. But then moving to the US, that loss of psychological safety, I don't think I would have used that word to label it, but that was probably what I was experiencing as an immigrant is, oh, something doesn't feel right. So it's, I like that, giving that language to that experience. I think it would be very helpful for our listeners as well. Yeah. One of the things that Black people experience as they enter into leadership positions, or just as they try to advance themselves as graduate students and things like that, is this kind of sense of feeling as though they may need to do some extra things to either maintain their position or to be seen as equal. Tell me, talk a little bit about some of these things that sometimes Black grad students, Black leaders feel like they have to do to be seen, as equal or as competent.
Absolutely. So think about just the earliest scripts that Black American children receive. Keep your head down. Don't act up. If you're in public, keep family business in the family. If you're going to an interview or you're going to an event, you are expected to dress up, right? Because dressing up means you belong and that you get permission. You get this social permission to go in. And I don't think it's any different in the higher education field and also just in my consulting work. So my organization does a lot of leadership development. And so I'm thinking, for example, Cosmos Consulting engaged a group of leaders that are preparing for executive roles. Mm-hmm. And one of my students was a Black woman and brilliant, just like every idea from her brain, I wanted to just bottle it up and keep it. And I think about just her being the only Black woman in a group of other executive prepping leaders. And so even in Zoom calls, if she needed to, tend to her daughter as a single Black mother, she would feel guilt about that later on. And we would have, if we would have a coaching session and I'd say, well, there may be other people who need to tend to their children as well. Mm-hmm. But I also understood that there's this additional layer of expectation that she feels this need to have to do more and need less. So not asking for accommodation, not asking for any sort of shifting in programming, or else that's seen as additional points against her. And what was great about that is what was just really telling about that was that my business partner and I could come together and say, something is missing in the inclusive quality of our programming if someone is feeling like they can't access the information or access the program in the same way and they feel some additional pressure. So it was good data for us, but I thought to myself, everything she's saying, I've felt that. Mm-hmm. I feel the need to be more in situations because I'm a Black woman. And if I'm with my white counterparts, I know that right away I'm hyper visible because I'm the only Black woman, but then I'm also invisible, right? Unless I show that I'm additionally talented or additionally capable of something. So it just puts so much additional pressure. That's what Black women have the burden of being hyper visible and also invisible at the same time. And so it's people call it mental Olympics. It really is. It's be invisible enough that you don't make waves or you don't have the stereotypes placed on you, but be visible enough that people acknowledge your strengths and they acknowledge your education and your capabilities. And I would say it's exhausting, but it's a lifelong exercise, right? So you build that muscle over time.
And you're right. I mean, there's kind of this feeling of with that representation, kind of that weight of like, okay, are people going to generalize who I am to like all Black people? So I like when you said that kind of doing more but needing less. That sometimes people feel, as not wanting to need too much, wanting to need too many accommodations, just wanting to kind of be perceived as strong. And, And it's a kind of survival, and it's a kind of a historically kind of survival strategy to be perceived as strong. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, think about, so if I'm a privileged person, if I'm used to having my life laid out a certain way, when it doesn't present itself that way, I will complain. I will make note, and someone needs to fix it. But if I've lived a life where I have to settle for less all the time anyway, if something doesn't present itself the way I need it to be, I go into a restaurant, I don't get seated right away. I just sit quietly and just still have that inner sense that I'm just glad to be invited, instead of seeing myself as just as deserving of the same, standing as someone, standing next to me. I think that's what happens in the leadership world. We're just so happy to be invited that we struggle to, hold the accountability on others, to create true space.
Wow. So now the other kind of thing that we had spoken about a little bit as we were preparing for this podcast was just generally the idea of organization values, especially in the wake of George Floyd and all of that. A lot of organizations across the country made a concerted effort to become anti-racist and to have things within their organization kind of mission and values represent that kind of energy behind being anti-racist. And we talked about how it's kind of trendy even to have them written on the wall and on the websites and things like that. And nothing wrong with that. But how does it trickle down to the day-to-day employees? Are they really connected to those values? If you were to ask, the person here or there, what does this value mean? How does it play out? Sometimes people wouldn't really know what to say. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And, as I know that that's something you probably, cover when you're teaching about organizational psychology.
Yes. So I tell this story all the time to students that as a consultant, I remember walking into an organization, it was gorgeous, and it was a huge organization, but one where there were probably a few people in top leadership positions, and the vast majority of the employees are the day-to-day workers, doing the custodial work, the maintenance, stock. And so they had the values painted like across these big, beautiful walls. And, I saw integrity, and so I remember just turning to the woman who was about to go in and clean the bathrooms. And I said, "This is great. These are your organization's values." She's like, "Yeah." And I was like, what does integrity mean to you? Like, what does it mean for that to be a part of your organization's values? And she was like, "I don't know." She's like, "I'm just trying to have a job here, please." And so that really sparks a lot of my work when I think about coaching leaders. Does their team even understand what their organization's mission, vision, or values really mean? And a lot of the best work we've done is putting behavior with values. So not just saying a term, because we all picture something different when we think about a word, but really working as a team or as an organization to define what are the behaviors behind the value, so that instead of saying that was integrity, instead saying you were true to your word, you said that you would come through with this project and you did. That's what we do. That's our value set, because that's the concrete behavior that I can attach to that value. That's the best work, I think, is when we agree on something together and we define what it looks like instead of the sort of performative integrity.
Yeah. I mean, because it sounds great, it sounds really great, and it's great for marketing and things like that,
Yep.
But you're right. Like if it's not being lived out, if folks don't understand what the behaviors are that kind of represent those values, then what's the point really,
And it's more than just if people understand it. People are they're being appraised based on these values. So think about an annual appraisal. Sometimes they just put the values as categories and you get rated 1 to 5. So if someone doesn't understand what that looks like, how can the lower down you are on that hierarchy, the more disconnected you are? You don't even know why you've received the score you've received. You can't even speak to how you've embodied those values because you don't have a true sense of how you're being appraised, in those values. So it impacts pay, it impacts position, growth potential. It's huge. And that's before you even think about the value actually being something an organization's engaging for the betterment of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you had shared with me a beautiful graphic, and I wish I could kind of share it with folks, but I'm sure I think it's maybe I'll put the website that it came from in like the comment section. But it was a chart called "Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture."
Yes.
And it was a chart about white supremacy culture in leadership and organizations. And I'd never seen a chart like that before because, a lot of times we kind of think about things, just how they play out, I think, socially, but not really how they might play out in an organization structure. And it was a very interesting kind of chart. And it had 12 different points on them. I think it was 12. And so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I was going to just pick out 3 things that maybe we could talk about a little bit more, just 3 things that stood out to me. And the first one that caught my attention, and this represents a dynamic that challenges many systems. And people don't always use this specific term, but it's paternalism.
Right.
And so I'm just going to read for folks what the description of paternalism is. In paternalism, decision-making is clear to those with power, but unclear to those without power. Those with power feel capable of making decisions for and in the interests of those without power. Those with power don't view as important or necessary understanding the views and expectations of those for whom they decide.
Right.
And again, I think on one hand, it can sound like, well, those with power, there has to be some kind of system of organization for how decisions get made, right? So tell me a little bit about what makes that white supremacy culture.
Right. So I want to just give credit that this is adapted from White Supremacy Culture by Tema Okun. So I love to give credit where credit's deserved. And the chart is actually about not just, you hear white supremacy. It's not just white people engaging in this behavior. It's actually that it's a white supremacy culture that we all engage in and we all have seen as the normal way of being. So in a team, if the top leader of a team is the one making decisions for everyone and they're not engaging everyone in conversation, it means that they don't see the rest of their team as true stakeholders. Even though those decisions will impact this group of folks, they're not actually brought into the conversation. And so that's when you come to work and you just see a notice, in the staff room, and it says like, oh, from now on, this is the new standard of this, or from now on, everyone will have to do this. But there's been no conversation. There's been no perspective sharing. There's no understanding of what unintentional negative impact there could have. So, but we are used to working in environments where we come in and we just are told what is going to be. And for people who are in power, they make these decisions quickly because they need to just get going. They just throw the decisions down, and there's not even a period of assessing the impact of those decisions. That is white supremacy culture. And one of the antidotes that this chart recommends, which is why I love it, because it recommends steps, is to actually just begin to introduce more transparency in decision making. Even sitting down and having a conversation with your team to say, these are the issues that the challenges we were presented with. We had a very limited amount of time to engage. I'd love to hear people's thoughts, but really here's our rationale for why we needed to do this thing. Can folks tell me what would be helpful in helping to transition from the way we were doing something to the way we're going to need to do it moving forward? Or better than that, right before the decision is made, we have this current challenge. I'd love to hear thoughts about what people think we could do to engage this challenge. That would be a perfect world.
It sounds so simple, right? But it can be so complex, and I imagine that's part of when you do kind of coaching and teaching, that's something that comes up from time to time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So the second thing that kind of caught my attention is objectivity. And specifically, it starts with saying that the problem is a belief that objectivity is possible. So the belief that emotions should not play a role in decision making or group processes. And so objectivity requires people to think in a linear fashion and ignore those who think in other ways. And there is impatience with any thinking that does not appear logical.
Right. So I love this one because it speaks to why this is called characteristics of white supremacy. Because at the core of this characteristic, there's this belief that there's this one central way.
Mm-hmm.
That one central way is often based in white culture. And so when a decision needs to be made or when something is being formed or developed, if you have a worldview that is different than the central worldview, which is usually white and American, you're seen as not having as much value, your perspective. Instead of it being seen as a value add, it's seen as something that deters progress. So the antidote really to this is engaging how people brainstorm, how people strategize, making sure that there's representation to engage multiple worldviews, and that perspective taking is a part of any process, that you're engaging as a team or as an organization, or else you're basically just allowing for one single way of thinking and being to just be the way you go on. That means that team is not a learning team. It's not a growth mindseted team. It's one that's stagnant.
And I, as you mentioned, that people have different perspectives and it comes from their worldview, kind of respecting that not only one worldview is valid. I think that's really interesting because I think sometimes in some systems when decisions are made, you're right, there's not kind of this attention paid to that decision is based on a worldview. That the decision of what's right and what's not right is based on a worldview, and that there might be multiple kind of worldviews. So interesting to kind of at least to think about entertaining and discussing that, regardless of what the decision ends up being, that the teams tend to kind of feel more psychologically safe in that way when at least that discussion is had.
Absolutely.
And then the last one that caught my attention in white supremacy culture, it was called either or thinking. And in this one, things are either or, good or bad, right or wrong. You're either with us or against us. There's no sense that things can be both and. So it results in oversimplifying complex things, and it increases a sense of urgency that we must do this or that without time to consider a middle way.
Absolutely. So a lot of my work is in adaptive change and adaptive leadership. And that really hits that characteristic hits the mistake that we all engage in, right? Which is we need to get through things quickly. We need to just sort of come up with quick technical ways to engage what is actually a more complex adaptive challenge. So instead of recognizing that new skills need to be built, that we might need to step away from every way that we've done it in the past and engage more creative thoughts from all of our stakeholders, we kind of just zero in on like the path of least resistance, which only serves to put us into a pattern of doing the same things we've done with the same failures, the same points of failover, instead of thinking about what skills did we not build when we were engaging this challenge before? How do we step outside of our comfort zone and think about how we all might need to evolve and engage in creative processes to really think about this complex problem in a complex way instead of trying to apply like a technical solution. And perfect example, any organization that has experienced a lot of turnover and they're struggling to, get more, talented or skilled employees into the organization, they just keep putting out more job postings. They're like, oh, more turnover, put out more job postings, but they never actually address what might be at the root, issue. Why are we losing employees? What's happening with the employees we have now? What's not desirable to outsiders to make them want to come into our organization? That deserves more conversation, more creative thinking, and more skill building that may not, currently be present.
Yeah, definitely. It's something to think about, especially in the current, I guess, during the pandemic, there had been a lot of, I think across the state, really, issues with, people kind of leaving jobs and changing careers and things like that happening. So I think definitely something for people to kind of think about.
Absolutely. One of the biggest ahas that organizations had post-pandemic is that people started to learn what it meant to spend quality time with their families. Folks who we take for granted going out to lunch every day for work and going out for breakfast before we go to work, people learned that they could save money having breakfast with their families in the morning because they're working remotely. They can make healthy meals. They could take care of their body and their spirit and their souls, right? While also working, which meant we got actually better quality of work from people. They could engage themselves as a whole system. And then organizations put the chop and said, all right, everyone return to work. But once you've gotten a peek into what your life could be, how you can engage whole self, it's really hard to go back. It's really hard to go back to putting the blinders back on. And hopefully organizations are starting to think about what has happened. We've had this huge shift in perspective. So how do we engage that? We can't apply the same technical structures that we've had in place to this new complex challenge.
Yeah. How do we embrace adaptability? Because this pandemic that we went through, it was just kind of life altering for people, both personally and professionally. And so as we are kind of in recovery mode, how do we adapt? What are the changes, the positive, the negative? How do we kind of embrace change for the better? What things do we need to hold firm to, and what things do we kind of need to let go of?
Absolutely.
Tough questions, right? Because it's going to, some of those are going to be different for different places.
Absolutely. Yes.
So as we kind of wrap up a little bit, I wanted to see, if I could ask you if you had any thoughts about resources, as organizations try to think about how to support Black leaders and how to, I guess, think about the white supremacy culture in their leadership structure. What resources can they maybe look at to learn a little bit more? I mean, I don't think anyone's going to be able to do this perfectly, but just to be able to feel one step closer to being in the right direction.
Absolutely. There probably, of course, I'm a book junkie. So yes, I have 1,000 books. And if folks could contact me, I could probably curate a list of like starter books. I tend to go with Adaptive Leadership. It's the title of the book. I look at McRae and Short and thinking about cultural dynamics on teams. But I would recommend, and of course I'm biased, but I would recommend reaching out to a consultant or organizational consultant or a leadership psychologist like myself, and engaging conversation around what is happening for your specific organization or your specific team, because it could be about what data needs to be collected first, right? We want to make assumptions, and then how people are actually defining what success would look like, and then starting to go from there, kind of painting that shared vision together. And it looks different for every team, for every organization. So that's, this is what I love to do all day long. So I'm always happy to, anyone can reach out to me and just start a conversation. And that is what thought partnership really looks like. It looks like starting the conversation of inquiry and starting to build out what actually, how are we defining what you're looking for in that area.
And so, it's Cosmos Consulting?
Cosmos Consulting. Yes. All about the unknown and exploring. So that's where the name came from.
So thank you so much for joining me today. Any final thoughts or anything else to share?
No, just, because I tend to take a very hopeful, optimistic view of everything, I tend to feel that the moment you're even starting to have the conversation, the moment you're starting to even want to take a deeper look at what's happening in your organization, what's happening on your team, what dynamic shifts are occurring, I think you're already on the right path. right? As soon as you're actually starting to do the self-observation, and you're starting to look at what's happening internally and externally, I think you're already doing the right first steps, right? I think you can only benefit from that. It's the same in therapy, right? The moment you sit down in the chair, you're already halfway through your therapy.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's if you're already in an organization where folks in leadership are open, they're open and they're making steps already. That's what else can you ask for? I mean, I said it's not going to be perfect, but you're open, you're making steps, you're doing what you can.
Absolutely.
That's the optimism. That's a good thing there. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and thank you for all the listeners out there that have been listening. You've been listening to Black Mental Health Matters with Dr. Carrie-Ann, and I will join you again next week for another podcast episode. So take care.